I've never really been one to share my personal business online, but after seeing a few similar stories, I felt like I had to get this off my chest. It's been a few years since this happened, and to be honest, even though my grandfather has since passed away, I still can't shake what my sister and I saw that night in that hospital. Hospitals are already the kind of places nobody actually wants to be. They're heavy. You can feel it the second you walk through the sliding doors, the weight of everyone's pain, the desperate hope, and the death. It's like the walls soak it all up. But this specific hospital, it was different. My grandfather, my abuelo, was a tough old man, stubborn as a mule, proud, and he worked himself to the bone his entire life. He also had this deep, borderline paranoid distrust of modern hospitals. He used to say that doctors today didn't care about healing people. They just wanted to milk you for every cent before you died. He was old school, and when he got really sick, he absolutely refused to go to any of those big, shiny medical centers. He insisted on being taken to this tiny private clinic he'd trusted for decades. It was located in an older part of the city, and looking back, the place was a total dump. From the street, it didn't even look like a hospital. It looked like a massive, old colonial-style house that someone had poorly gutted and repurposed. It had these weird, cramped additions sticking out at odd angles, narrow hallways that barely fit a gurney, and high, narrow windows. Half the wings looked like they'd been abandoned since the late 70s. Stained ceiling tiles, peeling wallpaper, and that dim, flickering fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like a corpse. But my abuelo wouldn't hear it. He said those were the only doctors who actually knew what they were doing. So, against our better judgment, that's where we took him. It was around 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was pulling the late shift, watching over him while my sister tried to catch some sleep on a small, cracked leather sofa in the corner of the room. The hospital was dead quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind where every tiny creak of the floorboards sounds like a gunshot. I was scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint, dragging sound out in the hallway. I figured it was just a nurse doing a late-night check, but the rhythm was off. It was slow, too slow. I looked toward the small, rectangular window in the heavy wooden door of our room. Everything was dark out there, except for one dim light further down the hall. And then I saw him. There was a patient standing right outside our door. He wasn't moving. He was just leaning slightly forward, staring through the glass, directly at us. I froze. I wanted to think he was just confused or lost, but there was something wrong with his face. In the low light, his eyes didn't look like eyes at all. They looked like two solid, pitch-black pits sunk into his skull. No whites, no pupils, just empty. He didn't knock. He didn't try to open the door. He just stood there, watching us. Breathe. The doctors eventually admitted him for a mix of respiratory failure and some heart complications, the kind of stuff that just starts failing when you get to that age. He wasn't hooked up to a ventilator, but he was in a delicate state. He needed constant oxygen and around-the-clock observation for a few days. My family is pretty traditional when it comes to stuff like this. We never leave someone alone in the hospital. We organized a rotation. My mom and my aunts would handle the daytime shifts, and my sister and I took the nights. It made sense. We lived the closest, and being younger, we were used to pulling all-nighters anyway. We figured we'd just mess around on our phones and drink coffee until the sun came up. The ass hospital had 3 floors, but only the first and half of the second were actually being used. It was a skeleton crew at best. There were a few occupied rooms, a tiny nursing station, and a waiting area with these old, cracked green vinyl chairs that smelled like industrial cleaner and dust. There was even this pathetic little chapel tucked into a corner, just a small alcove with a flickering light bulb and a dusty shelf where a statue of the Virgin Mary used to be. Now it was just an empty, dark hole in the wall. But if you walked toward the back of the second floor, the vibe shifted. That whole wing was basically abandoned. There was an old operating room back there and 2 recovery wards that hadn't been touched in years. The doors were all locked, and the windows in those doors were frosted over with grime. If you got too close, you could smell it. That heavy, stale scent of trapped dust and old building smell. Through some of the clearer glass, you could see silhouettes of old equipment and furniture covered in white sheets. In the dim light, they looked like people, just standing there, waiting. The first night I had to stay alone with my grandfather was rough. He couldn't sleep. He spent hours complaining about everything. The noise in the hall, the catheter, the hospital food, the fact that the AC was either too cold or not working at all. It was exhausting. Finally, around 1 a.m., he drifted off. He had that heavy, rattling breath that people get when they're struggling to stay comfortable. I sat in a chair right next to his bed, staring at my phone, trying my best not to let my eyes close. Our room door had one of those long, rectangular glass panels. It wasn't big, but it was enough to see whenever a nurse or a doctor walked by. I'd gotten used to seeing shadows flicker past every once in a while. But then, 3 a.m. hit. The entire atmosphere of the hospital changed. It wasn't just quiet. It's like the building itself had stopped breathing. No more distant voices, no phones ringing, no footsteps. It felt like the night shift had just walked out. The only sounds left were the rhythmic beep hiss of my grandfather's oxygen machine and the occasional distant squeak of a cart somewhere floors away. That's when I saw a shadow pass the window. It didn't move like the nurses. They usually hurried by with a purpose, their rubber soles clicking on the linoleum. This figure moved slow, methodical, like someone who should have collapsed minutes ago, but was somehow still upright. I didn't move to get any closer. This was different. A slow, labored shuffle, like every step was a massive effort. At first, I just thought it was a patient. You see that sometimes. People get confused. They wake up disoriented. But as he got a little further down the hall, into the better light, I noticed his head. It looked completely smooth, almost unnaturally pale. He was wearing this massive oxygen mask that covered nearly his entire face. It wasn't the thin plastic tube my abuelo had. It was one of those old-school, bulky, transparent masks with a thick, ribbed hose dangling from the bottom. I haven't seen anything like it outside of old medical textbooks. I don't know why, but I just stood there watching him through the door glass. He was wearing a standard hospital gown, but it hung off him like he was nothing but bone underneath. He kept his shoulders hunched forward, staring straight ahead as he moved toward the darker, unlit section of the hallway. I honestly thought about opening the door to ask him if he was okay, but right then, my grandfather made this wet, gagging sound, like he was choking on his own saliva. It snapped me out of it. I rushed over to him, adjusted his pillows, and gave him a few sips of water until his breathing leveled out again. By the time I turned back to the door, the hallway was empty. I didn't mention it to anyone the next morning. To be honest, I ducked into my grandfather's room and shut the door as quietly as I could. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I sat down and just stared at the door. A few seconds later, I heard it. Shuffle, drag, shuffle, drag. The footsteps stopped right in front of our door. Through the little rectangular window, I could see the silhouette of his head blocking the light. He was just standing there, inches away from the glass. I sat there, eyes glued to the silhouette on the other side of the glass. For a second, I thought he was just going to walk in. I mean, it happens all the time in hospitals. Patients get turned around, they're on meds, they walk into the wrong room by mistake. But he didn't even reach for the handle. He just stood there, perfectly still, in profile to me. His head was tilted at this slight, unnatural angle, like he was trying to listen through the wood. I'm not sure exactly how long he stayed like that. It was probably only 10 seconds, but in that quiet room, it felt like an eternity. My heart was thumping so hard against my ribs, I was sure it was going to wake my sister up. There was this weird wave of, I don't even know how to describe it, like a physical repulsion. I've been in creepy situations before, but this felt different. It wasn't just, I'm scared. It was this deep, guttural feeling that this thing, I couldn't even call it a person anymore, did not belong there, especially not outside my grandfather's door. I think I just hit my breaking point. I stood up, walked over, and yanked the door open, ready to say something, or at least see where he went. Nothing. The hallway was completely empty. It's not like he could have ducked around a corner. The hallway was long, and I would have heard the heavy, labored dragging of his feet. There was just silence. I stepped out and looked both ways. Nothing but the dim, flickering lights. A nurse came up the stairs a moment later and asked if I was okay. I just told her I was stretching my legs. I didn't want to sound like a lunatic, telling her I saw a man with an oxygen mask fused to his face disappear into thin air. I didn't say a word to my sister when I went back inside. I felt ridiculous. Plus, my grandfather was awake by then, and he was the kind of guy who would get worked up and fixate on something like that. I couldn't tell him I thought I was seeing ghosts. The next night, we were both back. I was running on fumes, so I finally crashed on the sofa for a few hours. Around 4 a.m., I was jolted awake. It wasn't a noise. It was just the way my sister suddenly sat up straight on the edge of her seat. That movement was enough to make my eyes snap open. She was staring at the door. I started to ask her what was wrong, but she immediately held up a finger to her lips, telling me to be quiet. Then she pointed at the window in the door. I got up as quietly as I could and crept over to the glass. He was back, but he wasn't standing in front of our room this time. He was about 20 feet down the hall, standing right in front of another doorway. The door to that room was wide open, revealing nothing but pitch black interior. I remembered who was in there. It was an older guy who had been admitted that afternoon. He was alone. His son had stayed for a bit, but had left hours ago. That thing was just standing there, staring into the darkness of that man's room. The figure just stood there, watching. My sister was breathing so quietly beside me, I could barely hear her. Then she leaned in and whispered, almost too low to hear, "Are you seeing this?" I just nodded. Honestly, that was the worst part, knowing it wasn't just my sleep-deprived brain playing tricks on me. She saw him too. She saw the same pale, wasted-away thing standing in the dark. "I thought it was just a patient," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the window. I didn't even know what to tell her. We both watched as the figure slowly, and I mean painfully slowly, leaned forward. It was like he was peering into the room, trying to get a better look at whoever was sleeping inside that darkness. My sister stepped back, her face pale. She'd seen enough. "I don't like this," she said. "Please, just close the door." I didn't argue. I shut the heavy wooden door, though I knew, deep down, it wouldn't really do much if that thing decided to come back for us. We sat there in total silence, our backs to the wall, just listening. My abuelo was out cold, completely oblivious to everything. We were waiting for footsteps, or a knock, or even the sound of that heavy oxygen hose dragging on the floor. But what we heard was much worse. First, there was a heavy, metallic thud. Then, the sound of furniture being shoved across the floor, followed by a muffled, desperate voice crying out for help. It wasn't a scream. It was this strangled, wet sound, like someone was trying to yell while having their airway pinched shut. My sister was out the door before I could even stand up. I followed right behind her. The door to the room down the hall was wide open now. A nurse was already sprinting towards it, and 2 more were coming up the stairs from the first floor. When we got to the doorway, I saw the patient. He was an older guy, half sitting up in bed, hacking and clawing at the air, like he was trying to pull an invisible weight off his chest. His gown was torn open at the collar, and his oxygen tubes were tangled around his arms and the floor. But it was his face that stayed with me. It wasn't just scared. He looked absolutely traumatized. He was pale, his eyes were bulging, and he kept grabbing at his own throat. "He's choking me," he gasped out, his voice raw. He's choking me." The nurses were trying to hold him down, telling him to stay calm, that it was just a night terror, that there was nobody else in the room. "Just breathe, honey. It was a bad dream," one of them said, in that overly calm hospital voice. "No, I wasn't asleep," he yelled back, his voice cracking. "He got on top of me. That man, he got on top of me." I immediately whipped my head around to look at the hallway. It was empty. There was no sign of the figure we'd seen right outside that man's door seconds before. A doctor finally showed up, looking half asleep, and started checking the guy's vitals. My sister and I just stood by the wall, trying to stay out of the way. One of the nurses must have noticed our faces, so she walked over and asked if we'd heard anything. My sister hesitated for a second. I thought she was going to stay quiet, but she didn't. "We saw a man standing right here," she told the nurse, her voice shaking. "Right before he started screaming. He was wearing an oxygen mask, a big one, and he looked really sick." One of the nurses frowned. She looked at the other one, like they were mentally scanning a list of patients. "Tall? Pale?"
she asked, her voice dropping. My sister cut in. He was very thin. He had no hair and this massive oxygen mask. The nurses went silent for a second. The first one looked back at the other, almost waiting for her to say something. But the other nurse just shook her head and said there weren't any patients in that wing who fit that description. But we saw him, I insisted. He was right outside our room last night, too. Is there anyone like that staying here? And they went quiet again. Then, the first nurse gave us that typical hospital brush-off. She said it might be a patient from another wing who wandered off, but she didn't sound like she believed it herself. She asked for more details, and when my sister started describing how his face looked, sunken, almost featureless under that oversized mask, her expression shifted. It wasn't fear exactly, but she looked deeply uncomfortable. "Okay," she said, her voice a bit more serious. "Do me a favor. Just stay in your room for now. Keep the door closed. If you see anything else, let us know immediately." We went back into my grandfather's room, shut the door, and this time we didn't just close it. We locked it and left the lights on. That was the first time my sister and I actually talked about it. Turns out, she'd seen him before, too. The night before, while I was crashed put for an hour, she'd spotted a silhouette standing perfectly still right outside the door window. She didn't wake up because she thought it was just a regular patient and didn't want to be that person who freaks out over nothing. I told her about the coffee run and how the guy had just vanished the second I opened the door. Neither of us wanted ghost. It felt too cheesy, too impossible. But we didn't really have another word for what was happening. From that point on, the rules changed. We didn't do solo shifts anymore. If one of us had to pee or go for water, the other stayed awake. We even told our mom the next day that we didn't want to leave the abuelo alone for a single second. We didn't give her the full story. Knowing her, she would have either called us crazy or had a panic attack. So we just told her the vibe of the place was making us uneasy. She thought we were being dramatic, but she didn't argue. Over the next 2 nights, we didn't actually see the Juan again, but things kept happening that kept us on high alert. One night, around 3:30 a.m., we were both sitting there in the silence when we heard the door handle. It wasn't a jiggle or a knock. It was a slow, deliberate turn. We both froze, staring at the handle as it rotated all the way down, hit the lock, and then slowly went back up. Whoever was on the other side didn't try to force it. They just let go. I waited a heartbeat, then rushed to the door and looked through the window. The hallway was empty, just that ugly, sickly yellow light reflecting off the floor, and the distant, tinny sound of a TV somewhere far away. Another time, my grandfather, who'd been heavily sedated and asleep, suddenly sat bolt upright. He didn't say a word. He just stared into the far corner of the room, right where the spare oxygen tanks were kept. He looked terrified. His eyes were wide, tracking something I couldn't see, moving slowly from the corner toward the foot of his bed. He didn't look at us once. He just kept staring until he finally drifted back into a restless sleep, leaving us sitting there in the dark, wondering what the hell was in the room with us. "Please, don't let that sick man in. Don't let him in." My grandfather's voice was barely a whisper, but it hit me like a physical punch. I asked him who he was talking about, and he just looked me dead in the eye and said, "The man who can't breathe." Now look, I know what you're thinking. My abuelo was exhausted, confused, heavily medicated, and at his age, people get confused. I wanted to tell myself he was just having bad dreams, but he didn't sound confused. He sounded sharp, lucid. He sounded angry, honestly, like someone he'd walked into his house without knocking and he wanted them out. My sister and I were reaching our breaking point. We were barely sleeping during the day, and every night we'd go back into that building. The tension would just sit on our chests like a weight. We started begging the doctor to discharge him or move him to another hospital. But he kept saying my abuelo needed just a few more days of observation. I couldn't exactly tell him, hey, we want to leave because there's a dead guy in an oxygen mask roaming the halls at 3 a.m. The final night was the worst. It wasn't because of an attack like the guy down the hall had. It was the feeling that this thing was finally coming for my abuelo specifically. I had stepped out to use the restroom, leaving my sister in the room with him. When I walked back in, she was standing right next to the bed, her body completely stiff. She wasn't even looking at me. Her eyes were glued to the door. "What happened?" I whispered. She didn't answer. She just pointed. The little window in the door was roughly at the height of my abuelo's bed. Behind the frosted glass, I could see a shadow. It wasn't a sharp outline, but it was unmistakably human, and it was pressed right up against the door. My abuelo was awake now too. His breathing was fast and shallow. Without even looking at the door, he gasped out, "Please, don't open it. Don't let it in." That's what really messed with me. He didn't have to look, he just knew it was there. It felt like he'd been feeling that thing's presence for hours. The shadow didn't move. It didn't tap on the glass. It just stayed there, hovering. I grabbed a metal folding chair, the only thing in the room that felt like it could be a weapon, mostly just out of instinct. My sister moved to the side of the bed and started frantically hitting the call button for the nurse, but nothing happened. I don't know if the system was down or if she just wasn't pressing it right in her panic, but no one was coming. Then the handle started to move. It was slow, really slow. Like whoever was on the other side was trying to be as quiet as possible. My heart was thumping so hard I could feel it in my throat. My sister was crying silently, and my abuelo's monitor started to beep faster as his heart rate spiked. I couldn't take it anymore. I don't know why I did it. It was probably the dumbest thing I've ever done, but I just snapped. I lunged forward and yanked the door open myself. He was standing right there, less than 3 feet away from me. I'll never forget it as long as I live. No description really does it justice. He looked like a patient, yeah, but one that had been dead for weeks. He was wearing a hospital gown that was stained and yellowed, hanging off a chest so sunken it looked like a hollow cavity. His skin was this bruised ash-gray color, the kind of color you only see on someone whose heart stopped a long time ago. His head wasn't just bald, the skin was stretched so tight over his bone that you could see every ridge of his skull. Those dark, sunken eyes just locked onto mine, fixed and unblinking. And the mask, that was the part that made my stomach turn. It didn't look like it was sitting on his face. It looked like his mouth had literally swallowed the plastic, and the tube was just swaying there, connected to absolutely nothing. He didn't lunge at me. He just stood there for a heartbeat, then slowly raised a bone-thin hand and pointed. He was pointing directly at my grandfather's bed. I honestly don't know where I got the strength, but I grabbed that metal chair and hurled it at him with everything I had. In the split second it took for the chair to leave my hands, he was just gone. He didn't fade away like a movie ghost. He was there, and then he wasn't. The chair slammed into the empty hallway wall with a deafening crash that echoed through the entire floor. 2 nurses and a tech came sprinting down the hall, alerted by the noise. My sister was already in tears, trying to explain what we'd seen, but I couldn't even get the words out. My abuelo was still agitated, his heart monitor beeping like crazy. One of the nurses, someone I hadn't seen on the previous shifts, walked right up to me. She didn't look confused or annoyed. She looked me dead in the eye and whispered, "Was it the man with the mask?" I just nodded, my throat completely dry. She didn't try to explain it away. She didn't tell me I was tired. She just turned to the other nurse and said, "Call the doctor now." Whatever history that hospital was hiding, those nurses knew about it. They didn't tell us, and honestly, we didn't stick around to ask. At that point, all we wanted was to get my abuelo out of there. The next morning, his vitals had stabilized just enough. My family didn't wait. We signed the discharge papers against medical advice and took him home. My abuelo didn't fight us on it. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about the cost or the doctors. He just wanted to leave. Over the next few weeks at home, he actually started to get better. His color came back, he started eating again, and he finally slept through the night. I never directly asked him if he saw the man. I didn't want to know. Only once, months later, I mentioned how weird the vibe was in that hospital, late at night, around 3 a.m. He just looked at me for a long time, then looked away. "Yeah," he said quietly, "there were things in there. I saw a lot more than I ever wanted to." That was the only time he ever spoke about it. My sister and I didn't talk about it for a long time either. But when we finally did, the details matched up perfectly. We both remembered the exact same things, the way the chest was sunken in, the way he stood perfectly still, and that mask, the way it looked like it was part of his skin. I still drive past that old building sometimes. It's even more run down now, and I've heard rumors they're finally going to tear it down. I hope they do, because whatever was walking those halls at 3 a.m., I don't think it's finished, looking for someone to take its place. I know some people will say it was just exhaustion. They'll tell me that the stress of seeing my grandfather like that, combined with the lack of sleep, just made me start seeing things. And honestly, if it had only been me, maybe I'd eventually talk myself into believing that. But it wasn't just me. My sister saw it too, at a completely different time. And then there was that guy down the hall, the one who almost died because he felt like someone was physically strangling him. My abuelo knew about the sick man before we even mentioned him, and that nurse, she knew about the mask before I could even finish the sentence. I don't know what that thing was. Maybe it was a patient who died in that hospital decades ago and just got trapped in some kind of loop. Or maybe it was something much worse. All I know for sure is that it's still there. Every night around 3 a.m., it's still roaming those cramped hallways, peering through the glass, waiting for a door to be left ajar. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't been there to keep that door locked. I don't think my abuelo would have ever made it out of that building.
This next story was shared by a guy named Holreal. It takes place in the house where he grew up, but to be honest, the roots of this story go back to long before he was even born. Holreal was the youngest of 3 brothers. By the time he came along, his older brothers were already 16 and 18 years old. Because of the huge age gap, they were already at a different stage in life, always out with friends or away at school. For the most part, he grew up feeling like an only child, spending the vast majority of his time alone with his mom. Their house had this massive patio in the back. It wasn't exactly pretty or well kept, but it had one defining feature: an enormous fig tree. This thing was ancient. His parents told him it had been there long before they even bought the place, and it had grown into a monster of a tree, as big as a fig tree can possibly get. When Holreal was a little kid, he started noticing something weird coming from that yard. It didn't happen every single day, but it happened often enough that it became a regular part of his childhood. Shh. He would hear a child crying. It wasn't a loud, screaming tantrum. It was this very low, muffled sobbing. The kind of sound a little boy makes when he's trying to hide the fact that he's crying. It sounded like it was coming from right under that massive fig tree. I remember the first time I finally told my mom about it. I went up to her and said, "Mom, there's a little kid crying outside in the yard." She didn't look surprised. That's the part that sticks with me the most. She didn't run to the window to check, and she didn't call out into the darkness. She just calmly stood up, closed the living room curtains, and told me I should probably just go to my room, watch some TV, and try to get some sleep. Before I left the room, I saw her grab this small bottle she kept in a cabinet right by the door and head out onto the patio. This happened a few more times over the years. I'd hear something, I'd tell her, she'd close the curtains, grab that bottle, and step outside. I'd just sit in my room, waiting. A few minutes later, she'd come back in, and everything would be dead quiet again. I always just assumed the kid had finally gone home. I never really thought much of it until I was much older. It wasn't until a few years ago that my older brother and I were hanging out, just talking about the old house, and he decided to tell me what actually happened before I was born. He told me that when him and my other brother were little, they heard the crying too. But for them, it wasn't just one voice. He said it sounded like a choir of scared kids out there in the dark. And they didn't just hear them, they saw them. Shh. Specifically, they both saw one little boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, who would peek out from behind that massive fig tree. He never came out all the way. He'd just stay half hidden, staring at them like he wanted to be seen, but was too terrified to move. They told my parents about it over and over, but for a long time, nobody believed them. They just figured the boys were feeding off each other's imaginations. Eventually, my dad got fed up with the stories and decided to check things out for himself. My brothers took him out to the patio and pointed to the exact spot behind the fig tree where the kid always seemed to be standing. My dad grabbed a shovel and started to dig. At first, it was just dirt and thick tree roots, but once he got about 3 feet down, the shovel hit something hard with a sickening thud.
When he cleared the dirt away, it wasn't a rock or a piece of wood. It was a bone. He dropped the shovel right then and there. He didn't even wait. He just went inside and called the police. When the investigators showed up and pulled the remains out, they confirmed exactly what my brothers had been saying. It was a child. And since there's no way a body ends up 3 feet under a tree by accident, they started digging up the rest of the yard. It didn't take long before they hit another spot. Another set of bones. Another kid. The investigators told us that those remains had been in the ground for over 50 years, way before my parents even signed the deed to the house. Since the people who lived there back then had already passed away, there was no one left to charge, no one to answer for what happened to those kids. The case was just closed, cold case, dead end. My parents were completely rattled. They didn't even want to look at the backyard anymore. A few weeks after the police left, they hired a crew to come in and pour a massive, thick slab of concrete over the entire patio. They literally wanted to pave over the nightmare and pretend it never happened. And for a long time, it actually worked. The house felt quiet, normal. But years later, that sound started coming back. That low, muffled sobbing. Shh. I was talking to my brother about it recently, and he told me something that's been keeping me up ever since. He thinks the reason I kept hearing that crying as a kid, even after they dug up those bodies, is because there's one more. One they missed. He's convinced there's still a child buried somewhere under that thick layer of concrete. Someone they left behind. And to be honest, I think he's right. Some nights, if I'm sitting in the kitchen and the rest of the house is dead quiet, I can hear a faint scratching coming from the patio door. It's not an animal. It sounds like someone is standing out there on that cold concrete, whispering, calling out, like they're still waiting for someone to finally let them inside.